Been starting my videos recently with pictures of the amp on the bench and Johnny Cash saying hey from the background. But this Matchless, I believe it's a Chieftain, will not fit. So we're not going to get the bench shot of this one. I'll take it apart and then you'll get lots of bench shots of it. The owner says it seems to be working fine, just wants it gone through to make sure that everything's great, which is a very wise thing to do on an amp at this price point, particularly as hot as Matchless tends to run their amps. So let me take it apart and we'll go through it and hopefully give it a clean bill of health. Okay, this acrylic rear panel has warped and cracked. And while it's warped all over a little bit, it's worse in this area where it's gotten hot. The deformation is worst here by the output tubes. And these things can run a lot at very high temperatures. It's cracked for the impedance selector switch. I'm not a fan of acrylic panels. If you get them thick enough that they don't warp and crack, then it's really hard to use pots with lock washers and jacks with lock washers. And if you get the thinner stuff so you can use the lock washers, this stuff cracks. It's one of the reasons I'm trying to source out the thin aluminum panels for my own amps. This amp has an issue that I see. I'll show it to you in a moment. Let me show you one thing first, though. See all these little grommets? All the tubes are mounted on them, all the tube sockets. And inside the amp in a Matchless, a lot of other connections will have those little grommets. And while they last, everything is fine. But over time, they do deteriorate and they need to be replaced. And that can be very time-consuming and make for very expensive repairs down the road. Matchlesses can sound great, but there's a high cost of ownership. These EL84s, these JJs, have been severely punished. They've been running way too hot, and so you can see the little bit of remaining red on some of the labels, but it's all burned to that light gray, almost a white. And that, plus all this deformation, shows that there's been way too much heat here. Matchless often biases their cathode bias amps way too hot. And that's not just a subjective thing. It is a foolish thing to expect a JJ or pretty much any current production tube to hold up like the old Brimars and Mullards did. And those have been abused in a lot of classic amps. And they got away with that abuse because there's a much higher grade of tube available in the 60s and 70s through the early 80s. And I think when Matchless was being designed, Mark was using a lot of what we would consider today new old stock tubes. I think the stash that he had access to had some really nice tubes in it, and his designs, I would say that he got away with stuff that aren't really amp design as a result. He got away with it because the tubes were better, but it's not optimal. So we need to optimize some things in here for longer tube life, reduced heat, without sacrificing tone. Interesting dampening material on this tube. I assume that's EF86 underneath that shield, yeah. I've got the outside of it covered in a fuzzy carpet material, which will dampen the outside, but it's not going to do much about the spring contacting the glass inside. I don't know if that was Matchless or someone else trying to make it mo better. Also make sure that the EF86, this thing doesn't want to go back on. I'll do it later. There it goes. I'm not sure if the EF86 has pins 2 and 7 tied to cathode or to ground. Some Matchlesses do, some Matchlesses don't. The data sheet says it is definitely a do. So if you think you're detecting scorn from Matchless in my tone, it is not scorn. Some of it is very good design. Some of what they do is fantastic. Usually their fault is that they're overbuilt and service becomes much more expensive than necessary. They far exceed mil-spec. And when you exceed mil-spec, you violate mil-spec. It makes it harder to service. And some of the stuff they did, I think, is just kind of dumb. So I'm not going to fawn over them because they're a famous amp company, but neither am I out to get them. The good, the bad, the ugly, the in-between, My job is to point it out for you guys. All right, so in here, the majority of the resistors are fairly standard 1 watt Zycons, mostly carbon films. A lot of Sprague cathode bypass caps, a lot of Mallory 150 M's, nothing esoteric, everything's fine. Samoa filter caps, I'm not a big fan of the brand, but hopefully they're okay. He's got all these 1 watt carbon composites here for the screens and grids on the output tubes. I need to check all those. I can't do that with the camera here, but I'll check those in just a second. And then there's a high and low output switch, which means you're running either all 4 EL84s with a certain bias or only a pair with a different bias. And I'm going to measure each condition and see where it's running at high power and at low power. Based on the tube's condition, either the bias is way off, the plate to cathode voltage is way too high, or there's a problem with the screen resistor in the screen grid resistor, or some combination thereof. I'll be right back. When I first powered this amp on, I was thinking that I would check bias levels. And the owner had said everything seemed fine, he just wanted a checkup. Everything was very much not fine. There was a tremendous, tremendous hum, and I could feel the entire amplifier vibrating from it. The output transformer was vibrating, the power transformer was vibrating. It had a very strong oscillation. And I powered it off. You can't measure bias or anything with that, though I did take quick measurements, and the B plus was really low, like 50 volts lower than it should be, which told me something was drawing way too much current. So the old Ruby rectifier tube was bad. In case you're wondering, using a metal can cap to hold a glass tube in place, it's not really the best idea I ever come up with. I've seen these just shatter in Matchless and Bad Cats and other people who do this. Even with a little bit of felt or whatever they put in there, it's approaching farcical. I already knew that the 4 JJ EL84s were bad. It's got a new JJ GZ34 in place. If you're wondering why there are 2 rectifier sockets, you can use either 2 5V4s or 1 5AR4, which is the same thing as a GZ34. The GZ34 gives you greater plate voltage and a little more headroom. And a new quad of Sovtech EL84s, and that massive hum is gone. I still have all the preamp tubes pulled. I don't know that they're good. I just have the phase inverter output tubes and rectifier tube in place. And that massive hum is gone, so that's good. And that oscillation would also hasten the decline of those EL84s, and the voltages are where they ought to be. And I've tested it in both half power mode, which turns off the outer pair of EL84s, and full power mode, which keeps all 4 of them going. In full power mode, the plate to cathode voltage is 316.2 volts. That's with 121 volts coming out of the wall. And the tubes are idling at 13.44 watts, which is a little bit warm, but not bad. Pretty much ideal. But if you go to half power mode, the plate to cathode voltage goes up to 338.4 volts. And the output bias, the pair of tubes are biased at 15.95 watts. And that is a recipe for tube death. So if you run this at half power and one pair of tubes starts to go south as a result, then you run full power, well, that one pair of tubes is going to affect the other pair of tubes as far as current conditions and stuff. It's just a chain of events. And it's not helped out by these truly stupid 100 ohm screen grid resistors, dutifully copied from JMI. It was a mistake that JMI made, and they got away with it because they had Mullards and Brimars. So these need to be increased in value, and I'll talk to the owner about that. At least 470 ohms. 1K is much better. And then I need to change the resistor. I believe it's this one, which is in place in series with this one when you're only running one pair of tubes. So I need to increase that so that the half power bias is not killing tubes. Before I do that, though, I'm going to power it off. I'm going to change this bulb and this bulb. This bulb's out, this bulb's dim, and put the preamp tubes in and see what it sounds like. I keep saying this, but it keeps being true. I'm constantly amazed by what people live with when it comes to their amps and what they think is normal. But this thing made horrible sounds, and the owner thought it was probably working pretty good. When he gets it back, he's going to think I'm a magician. And it's just attention to detail. It's not magic. It's barely science. This is changing spark plugs. All right, the AC30 channel sounds pretty good. The EF86 channel, I should say the top of his channel, not the AC30 sound channel, almost sounds good, but it keeps cutting out. I'll show you why. See that switch is totally loose on the chassis, which means that things are getting tugged and prodded. I could probably just manipulate some wires and get the sound to come back, unless something's broken. It was working, and then I moved this switch, and the whole switch moved, and it cut out. So let me tighten that up and see what has gone wrong, and then we'll get that channel back. It's working now. The chassis over here gets pretty warm already. In this area right here where these output tubes are, it's not a good combination for this acrylic to have high heat behind it for obvious reasons. But I can cool that down a little bit if I am allowed to change out those screen grid resistors. So let me go sweet talk the owner.